Namaste. Let us invoke the Divine Mother through Gayatri Mantra.
तत्सवितुर्वरं रूपं ज्योतिः परस्य धीमहि यन्नः सत्येन दीपयेत्
Welcome everyone to the second chapter of Vaichariki. Vaichariki is an initiative by Rashtam School of Public Leadership for thoughts, discussions, and dialogues. This is a part of the 150th birth anniversary year of Sri Aurobindo. In this second chapter, the topic is Varna and Jati, an integral perspective. I, Abhishek Panda, welcome Adarsh Pandit, researcher and career advancement manager at Rashtam School of Public Leadership, to take this forward. Welcome, Adarsh.
Thanks, Abhishek, and welcome everyone. So when I got this information that I'll have to, give the introduction on this topic, my mind directly went to an anecdote which happened a few years back. One of my friend who was appearing for an UPSC interview, he told me that when the interviewer asked him about his caste, he said that my parents associate themselves with as a Brahmin, but he never associates himself with any so-called caste. So Varna and Jati in itself is a contentious issue, especially in the way it has been served to my generation. The nuances are lost, and we have got a conclusion without even examining the details and nuances of this whole aspect. And so without wasting any further time, I think we have best men amongst us who can actually throw light on this topic, this rather contentious, and yet we need to know a very important topic for us. So I like to first welcome Sampada Nanji. Sampada Nanji, as we all know, is a very passionate scholar of Sanskrit.
So, as others were saying, I welcome Dr. Sampradananda Mishra, professor at Rashtam School of Public Leadership, to open this floor for the second episode of Vaichariki. Welcome, sir.
Namaskar to all of you, and again a grand welcome to all our speakers, Kundan, Ashish, and Nilesh, and the moderators, Manan and others. And thank you, Abhishek, for initiating. This is the second chapter, and then we started Vaichariki last month with the subject on education, and this time the topic we have selected is Varna and Jati. And as we all know how sensitive is this topic, and then what is going on connected to the Varna and the Jati. And here, as a part of this 150 years celebration of Sri Aurobindo and 75 years of India's independence, So we have started a series of activities of which Vaicharika is one monthly webinar where we take up one topic, one concept, one idea, and then we have a keynote speaker to bring the conceptual clarity on this, and then we will have the panelists to contextualize it and discuss it um, in the light of Sri Aurobindo and taking the contemporary issues and then linking it with the contemporary issues. So the panelists will be discussing, and there will be question and answer sessions where we invite all the viewers and all the participants to participate actively and then put their questions. And the topic today, Varna and Jati, especially when we, it's an age-old problem, we can say. It's not that just during this time, this phase of time, there are issues, but there are issues since when the decline started and the distortion started. So in the course of evolution, the original idea of Varna and Jati got distorted to a great extent. And then there are a lot of other forces which have crept into to make the distortion more acute. When we look at Sri Aurobindo, whose yoga is called the Purna Yoga, the integral yoga, the yoga of transformation. So Purnata Prapti, attainment to the fulfillment, to the perfection is the aim. And in that, Sri Aurobindo says, and Sri Aurobindo's yoga is central to the Divine Mother, where it is everything is organized around this central idea of the Divine Mother. And the human consciousness, Sri Aurobindo says, has these four major powers: the power of wisdom, the power of heroic strength, the power of love and harmony, and the power of endeavor and perfection, represented by, and we can also see the ancient Indian seers and sages, how they had envisioned this. And these are the four major powers of major manifestations of the Divine Mother. So the wisdom represented by the Maheshwari, and this is the Brahma Shakti. The heroic strength represented by Mahakali, the Kshatra Shakti, and love and harmony represented by Mahalakshmi, the Vaishya Shakti, and endeavor and perfection represented by Mahasaraswati, the Shudra Shakti. And all these Shaktis, all these four powers have to manifest well, harmoniously within the human consciousness in order to achieve that perfection, which is the aim of the yoga, aim of education, aim of life. So based on this vision of Sri Aurobindo, today's discussion will be carried forward, and I welcome Kundan, who will be giving the keynote address, elaborating this whole seed idea presented by Sri Aurobindo. And I welcome Ashish and Nilesh to contextualize this, taking the contemporary issues and then linking it to the vision of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. And I welcome all the participants and viewers and request them to participate actively and ask your questions and share your thoughts. And with these few words, once again, invoking the presence of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, I request others to take it forward. Dhanyavad.
I'll just introduce Dr. Kundan Singh ji. So Dr. Kundan Singh holds a doctorate in humanities with a concentration in East-West psychology from California Institute of Integral Studies, San Francisco. Earlier, he obtained an MA in applied psychology with a concentration in social psychology from the University of Delhi. After having served as a core faculty at Sophia University for close to a decade, where he taught at the doctoral level, Kundan Singh ji joins the Hindu University of America as a core doctoral faculty. He has been a scholar plus a practitioner, which is quite important in our darshana. And he has been a scholar and a practitioner of integral yoga and the darshan of Mother and Sri Aurobindo. He has taught in areas of integral philosophy, psychology, and covering almost all the aspect of psychology, postmodern, Vedant, everything. He's a senior fellow with Hindupedia, where he is diligently involved with changing the representation of Hinduism and India in the grade school textbooks in California and across the US. I guess this can also happen in India. He's also co-authored books. One of his book he has co-authored with Krishna Maheshwari titled "Making Children Hindu-Phobic: A Critical Review of McGraw-Hill's World History Textbooks." He has written another book titled "The Evolution of Integral Yoga: Sri Aurobindo, Sri Ramakrishna, and Swami Vivekananda." He has also published several papers and book chapters on psychology, science, relativism, Indian psychology, and postmodernism. He is also the vice president of Cultural Integration Fellowship, an institution in San Francisco inspired by the teachings of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. So I'll stop here. Again, I can go on and on with his introduction because there is so much that is needed. But I'll stop here and I'll hand the platform over to Kundan Singh ji. Namaskar, sir. Please take it forward.
Sure. Thank you, Adarsh. And thank you, Sampath, for inviting me. Am I audible? Are you able to hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You are audible.
Could I see some faces on the screen? It would be good to have some faces on the screen. It would be easier for me to talk. Otherwise, it feels as if I'm staring into a screen. Good to see you, Raghav.
Good to see you, sir. Spoken like a professor.
Thanks. I've been doing this for a while now, Raghav. It's my pleasure to be here and be speaking on a topic which is extremely important from the Indian perspective. And as Adarsh pointed out right at the very beginning of this talk, that this issue is indeed contentious. And on most occasions, what happens is that it brings about tremendous amount of emotive issues. It's a very charged topic, and so charged that most people are not able to inquire into it. And what is important at this point in time is that we make an inquiry into this topic. It will not be very easy to cover this in a short span of time that we have. But given the lights that Sri Aurobindo has shed on this particular issue, I think we will be able to cover most certainly the broad areas. Now, the first thing that we would want to understand and know is that there was a particular point in time in India's history when the narrative on India, in Indian history, Indian culture, Indian sociology, Hinduism, and almost everything about India began to get distorted. And over a period of time, it got distorted quite significantly. You know, these days we talk a lot about narrative and we talk about the importance of narrative. Let me contextualize this from the perspective of Vedanta. You know, as many of you would know, that Vedanta speaks about different planes of consciousness. It talks about Annamaya Kosha, Pranamaya Kosha, Manomaya Kosha, Vijnanamaya Kosha, Anandamaya Kosha, you know, which are basically manifestations of Satchidananda. All these different planes of consciousness are interconnected. They're discrete planes, and at the same time, they're interconnected with one another. For this discussion, it would suffice to say that Manomaya Kosha is interconnected with Pranamaya Kosha and Annamaya Kosha. Narrative essentially resides in Manomaya Kosha. And what it does is that it alters the Annamaya Kosha. In other words, narrative alters everything which is there on the physical plane, on the terrestrial plane. So around 1817, there was a particular narrative which was put in place. This narrative represented the Indian social system in a particular manner. And a lot of what we see in India today at this point in time is basically an outcome of that narrative. This narrative painted the Indian social system as hierarchical and oppressive, and basically made the so-called caste system the defining feature of Hinduism. This narrative continues, and it continues in many different ways. Now, because our Indian social system got represented through caste system, which is described as hierarchical and oppressive, that our entire understanding about Varna and Jati has got convoluted. And because this narrative has been regurgitated over and over again, that there were certain categories of people who oppressed the rest, that for most Indians, they would not even want to touch this issue with a 6-foot pole. They want to abstain away from it as much as possible. The discussion, because many of us would know that the discussion has the potential and the capacity of destroying relationships, of destroying interactions. Relationships maybe, decades old. It certainly has that possibility. What we are going to do today is to basically examine critically this narrative, the veracity or the truth or of this description that the Indian social system right from antiquity has been hierarchical and oppressive. What is the truth behind this statement? Is this statement true, or is there a gross distortion? Or is this statement partially true, partially false? What is the matter? In the Foundations of Indian Culture, Sri Aurobindo has explained this system very nicely. And Sri Aurobindo says that the system had a very different understanding when it was put in place. And over a period of time, it underwent a certain degeneration. This degeneration is an outcome of internal decline and external aggression, and we are going to look at all the different shades which I just described. What was the system like when it was put in place? What was the system like in the Vedic times? When Sri Aurobindo says that things were done at the level of intuition, and within the Indian social system or social existence, there was a lot of suppleness, there was a lot of flexibility, there weren't any fixed forms. And in order to understand this conceptualization, this enunciation, it will be very, very important for us to understand the Sankhya system. Very briefly, Sankhya, of course, is very broad, but I'm going to address that aspect of Sankhya or that part of Sankhya, which is relevant to our discussion now. Sankhya is one of the first systems which basically talks about creation or manifestation. What does it say? It says that two principles, Purusha and Prakriti, were unmanifest. The manifestation had not happened, the creation had not happened. They were in a state where you can say they were beyond space, time, and causation. Prakriti has three modes, or three qualities, or three gunas. All these three gunas that are equal in nature were at rest. When Purush came in contact with Prakriti, this equilibrium got disturbed. And when this equilibrium got disturbed, manifestation began through the concentration of Sattva. The cosmic intelligent principle called Mahat was born or came into existence. This Mahat is manifested in an individual, in a human being, as Buddhi. So Buddhi in every human being is constituted by Sattva. From Sattva, through the concentration of Rajas, Ahankar was born. The principle of self, individual self, or the ego principle. Now, from Ahankar on one side, through the concentration of Sattva again, Manas, Gyanendriyas, and Karmendriyas were born on one side, and through the concentration of Tamas on the other side, Tanmatras and Mahabhutas came into existence. So this is how, the cosmos came into existence. Now, when you look at the sequence of things, it is not that Rajas is born out of Sattva and Tamas is born out of Rajas. That is not the sequence that you get. What you get is that these important principles, or these three important qualities, they interacted with one another and gave birth to different entities within the universe. And there's a very important ancient principle that we have, which is that every microcosm has the macrocosm in it. So whatever is there in the cosmos is present in every microcosm, including us. So all these three modes, or all these three gunas, they are basically in flux. They are in flux, and they have created different aspects of our being, and most certainly our psychological being. What Sri Aurobindo says, and this is an ancient principle, that the predominance of a particular guna, that basically gives a distinct swadharma or swabhav to an individual. So if there is predominance of sattva within an individual, the individual will be naturally inclined to pursue knowledge, calmness, peace, harmony, and so on and so forth. This individual will want to figure out the ultimate secrets of existence. At some point in time, he or she will go in search of the ultimate, which in our tradition is enunciated by Brahm. Because this individual is going to go after Brahm, because this individual is going to become interested in knowing the secrets of Brahma, this individual is a Brahman. Now, what is the next principle? The next principle is Rajas. And as I told you earlier, it's not that only one of the gunas is present in an individual. All the three gunas are present. It's just that predominance of a particular guna, it gives a certain psychological attribute to an individual. So the person who has the predominance of Rajas in him or her is basically going to seek power. Will be an individual who will be interested in dominating others. Will be an individual who will be interested in matters of governance and politics. Will be an individual who will be warrior-like. In the traditional scheme of things, this individual was Kshatriya. Similarly, if there was combination of Rajas and Tamas within an individual, and what does Tamas do? When there is predominance of Tamas within an individual, it is found that the individual will neither seek knowledge nor will be dynamic in orientation. The individual will be prone to inertia, laziness, and sloth. We don't need to have any judgment about this. This is the nature of reality. And if there's a combination of Rajas and Tamas within an individual, that individual will have the propensity or tendency to seek wealth. That individual will not be interested in seeking knowledge or a career in which governance and politics are involved. That is not what is going to inspire the individual to act. It will basically be the seeking of wealth. This category of people were called as Vaishya. And in an individual who had the predominance of Tamas, he or she was designated by the name Shudra. So this is how, the system was conceptualized, and it was very psychological when it was put into existence. And there is profound psychological truth behind it. And this psychological truth also comes from what you find in the Vedas, where it is mandated that every dharma should be aligned with Rita. If Rita and dharma are aligned, then the universe flows properly. Everything flows. I'm sure some of you would be familiar with this term, the Tao, the Chinese Tao. The flow of things. So what did the ancient seers do? They realized that the predominance of a particular guna, it creates a certain kind of a swabhav, which creates a certain kind of swadharma, which needs to be aligned with the vocation or karma that an individual chooses. I see many young faces over here, and I'm pretty much sure that you guys must be having this conversation amongst your friends where, many of them must be saying that they do not want to pursue this vocation or that vocation, but there is societal or parental pressure on them because of which they are doing certain things, right? Now, the reason why a lot of people are facing this trouble, this psychological battle, this existential crisis because of lack of choice, of vocation or because of imposition of vocation on them is because their predominant guna is not being honored. They are not finding the right vocation. They are not finding the right karma. And when I say karma, I am not talking about prarabdha karma or how karma is actually understood in contemporary times today. I'm basically talking about the vocation of an individual. Now, this determined the varna of an individual. So you see that there is a particular equation that emerges over here. When you look at the Vedic times, guna equals swabhav equals swadharma equals karma equals varna. This was the relationship. And Sri Aurobindo says that the system had a lot of flexibility. What is the evidence for this? Going to the very root word of varna. Varna comes from the root word vri. Vri means to choose. Interestingly, this is also the root word of bridegroom, vara. So do you see what I'm saying? That in the ancient times, not only the varna one chose, but women also chose their husbands. It is embedded in the root of the word itself. There was choice in the matter. Now, because there's so much of superstition associated with Jyotisha, I'm sure that many of you have not done your charts or have not got your charts done. If you get your birth chart done, if you get your Janma Kundli done, if you get your Janma Kundli made, you will find that there is a section there which talks about your varna. Is this varna birth-based? Is it based on the family in which you are born? No, not at all. It is completely based on you as an individual. Because within the same family, if you will compare birth charts, you'll find that different people have different varnas. And I think this understanding of varna being individual was very much alive in the ancient times. And that is why there was flexibility and suppleness that Sri Aurobindo talks about. Many of you must have heard the story of Satyakam Jabala. What is the story? It is in one of the Upanishads. This individual goes to an individual or to some individuals to learn. And there it is asked of him, what is his varna? And this individual says, well, I don't have any idea. My mother is a maid. She worked in different houses. And in one of those homes, she conceived me. He honestly tells the sage what his mother had told him about his lineage. So when he narrates this story to the sage says that you can only be a Brahmin. Why? Because you are speaking the truth. It is not because, the Brahmins were exalted. The Brahmins were manifesting certain characteristics. And because this individual, was manifesting a certain characteristic, that the sage decided that he was a Brahmin. That actually reminds me of another story which you find in the Mahabharata. Karna, he disguises himself and goes to learn from another sage. And, many of you know about that story, so I'm not going to repeat. He begins to get bitten by a scorpion, and thinking that if he moved his legs on which the sage or his teacher was sleeping, he would basically disturb the sleep of his teacher or guru. The scorpion kept stinging him and he sat still. And when blood began to ooze, it woke the sage up. And the sage Parshuram says, who nurtured some issues or problems with the Kshatriyas, that Karna could not have been a Brahmin. A Brahmin by nature would not have tolerated the pain that the scorpion was given to the individual. So Parshuram says, well, this is the guna or the characteristic of a Kshatriya. You can only be a Kshatriya. And the story continues. I'm not going to go into the details. But what I'm trying to say to you is that till a certain point in time, the connection between guna and swabhava was very, very operative or operational within the Indian society. And there was a certain flexibility. You find this from certain verses in the Rig Veda also, where it becomes very clear that the child of a set of parents is not necessarily supposed to be undertaking the vocation of his or her parents. But as time progressed, and Sri Aurobindo talks about this suppleness or this flexibility, this began to get lost. And this began to get lost, particularly at a time when the population, instead of pursuing truth through yogic means or intuitive means, began to pursue knowledge through intellectual means. When the system began to get stratified, when systems began to get made out of the spiritual truths that had been accessed at one point in time. And this stratification that I just spoke about was also the cause of the internal decline of the Hindu society or the Indian society. And why do I say this? I say this because the social system became birth-based. So the inherent flexibility that the system had at one point in time, or it had till a certain point in time, began to get lost. What is the evidence for this? What I have done is that I have gone into this particular book thoroughly. This is Gautam Dharma Sutra. This is the earliest of the extant Dharma Sutra, which is available at this point in time. Were there Dharma Sutras written before this one? I'm pretty much sure. Because there was a lineage. There was a lineage of Dharma Sutras. And there were certainly quite a few that were written later. And the commentaries on these Dharma Sutras came to be known as Dharma Shastras. And Manusmriti is one of the Dharma Shastras. There are many others. We don't need to go into the details. But when I go into this text, I certainly do find that the system has started losing its flexibility And as it is losing its flexibility, it is becoming birth-based. And when it became birth-based, the earlier equation that I spoke about, that got changed. What is the equation that you find now? At this point in time, the equation is Varna equals karma. And once again, karma vocation. So it was your Varna, which was birth-based, which was determining your karma or the vocation that you are going to engage in. And it was supposed that these two will basically give rise to your Swabhav, Swadharma, and so on and so forth. So what is it that you find here? The spiritual principle or the inner connection which the system had earlier began to get distorted. It began to become externalized. It began to become birth-based. And instead of this system remaining, or this understanding remaining an individual affair, it became a communal affair. But here also, we are not certain when this text was written or when it came about. The system had not become completely ossified, because there is a certain flexibility that you see within the system. And what are some of those flexibilities? I'm going to enumerate them to you. If you did not engage in a particular karma for a few generations, then your family would lose the Varna. And the details are given. If a Brahmin family did not engage in the karma of a Brahmin for 3 generations, and instead did the karma of a Kshatriya, then in the 4th generation, the family would become a Kshatriya. Similarly, if a Brahmin family engaged in the karma or the work or the vocation of a Vaishya for 5 generations, then in the 6th generation, the family would become Vaishya. And if for 7 generations, the family engaged in the work of a Shudra, then the family would become a Shudra. This system was called Varnatkarsh. Consists of 2 words, Varn plus Apkarsh. Similarly, one could actually climb up the ladder. One could regain one's lost Varna status. This process was called Varnopkarsh. This is described. Now, this story is very fascinating. Actually, you should know about it. See, it is good to have opinions and ideas later, but only after the inquiry has been made. I'm not saying that we need to subscribe to this model. I'm not glorifying this model. I'm just telling you how this was, how the changes happened, how things moved from, from time to time. So what we are doing is that we are looking at the stages. When you stop at the time of Gautam, who created this Dharma Sutra by the name of Gautam Dharma Sutra, you find that though the system had become stratified, it still was retaining its flexibility. In this time, intervarna marriages were also allowed. Not all intervarna marriages were allowed though. Only some were allowed. And they are called Anulom marriages. What was an Anulom marriage? The Anulom marriage was when the man was, of the same or a higher order than the woman. When the situation was reversed, those marriages did not have sanction of the Dharma Shastra, Dharma Sutra tradition. What happened to those people who engaged in marriages that were not allowed, that were called Pratilom marriages? They were banished from the fourfold order. This is how the system of untouchability in India was born. These people were called Patit. And contact with these people was suppressed, was negated. In fact, it was punishable. If one engaged in a Patit, he or she could also become a Patit. And these so-called Patit basically settled on the fringes of the society. That is the reason, even today in rural India, if you travel, you will find that the so-called untouchables, I don't like using these terms, but we have to engage in analysis. I'm just like being a doctor, who's conducting a diagnosis. They live on the fringes of the society, and they live in between human settlements. This is a reality which you will find even today. Now, this system does not talk about prison. There were other people also, who would violate social norms and customs from time to time. They were also banished. They also became Patit. And they would live on the fringes of the society. There's a very detailed description which is given of various classification of people that are born through different kinds of Anulom as well as Pratilom marriages. Now, many of you would know that the ancient Indian society was divided in 4 ashramas. The Varna system was only followed in Brahmacharya and Grihastha. I'm repeating this. It was only followed in Brahmacharya and Grihastha. It was not followed in Vanprasth and Sannyas. And this entire thing is very logical. Why do I say that it is logical? An important condition for becoming a yogi is basically to transcend the gunas, the 3 gunas. Within the Indian system of thought, can I have more faces, please? I'm telling you, it feels absolutely weird. I know young people, they don't need a lot of contact, they can communicate with people even without looking at one another. But I'm a little old school. I need to look at people, so if I don't see faces, then it's very difficult to communicate. I see some movement. With others, it seems, they've just turned the thing on and maybe doing other things, but that's okay. So going back to where we were. So, for an individual to become a yogi, for an individual to become enlightened, for an individual to gain nirvana, it is extremely important that he or she transcends the 3 gunas. And when he or she transcends the 3 gunas, the individual becomes Trigunatita. There's a term, which our culture uses for yogis, Trigunatita. When an individual takes Vanprasth or Sannyas, the idea is that he or she is basically going to engage in practices that will lead to the transcendence of 3 gunas. that individual is on his or her way to becoming Trigunatita. And that is why even today in traditional India, nobody asks the jati of a sadhu. Vanprasthis and sannyasis, they don't have varna and jati. Jati na pucho sadhu ki. It's a very common refrain that you will find in rural India even today. You know, most illiterate of the Indians know this. They might not be able to give you the metaphysical explanation, why this is happening. They might not be able to explain Sankhya to you. But this understanding is embedded in the folk tradition. It's there. It's part of the folk wisdom. You see? So what I'm saying to you is that even when the system began to get stratified, it did not lose its flexibility. Now, in terms of hierarchy, which you definitely see, in Gautam Dharma Sutra, what you do not come across is an absolute hierarchy associated with any varna. Why? There are many different scales of hierarchy. You have knowledge hierarchy. And when you have the knowledge hierarchy, what is it that you find? You find Brahmin at the top, Kshatriya next to him or her, then Vaishya, and then Shudra. Then you have the scale of power hierarchy. You have Kshatriya at the top, then you have Brahmins, then you have Vaishya, and then you have Shudra. Now listen to this. This is a very important one. Wealth hierarchy. You have Vaishya at the top. You have Kshatriyas. Then you have Shudra. And you have Brahmins at the bottom. It was mandated that Shudras be paid for their work. Whereas a Brahmin was supposed to survive on dhan and nothing but dhan. And that is the reason in the Jatak stories and many of the folk tales, you will come across this term, Daridra Brahman, very, very commonly. And in fact, some of the poorest Brahmins in India today survive. And they survive because traditionally they were not supposed to accumulate wealth. So the Brahmin families that kept aligned themselves to the Dharma Shastra principles, they never ended up accumulating wealth for themselves. And that is the reason you find some of the poorest Brahmins in India today. This is the reason. Then you have the service hierarchy. In service hierarchy, you find Shudra at the top, Vaishya next to Shudra, then Kshatriya, and then Brahman. Now, when you bring all hierarchies together, the sum does not give, one vector. All these different vectors, they basically cancel out one another. And that is why you do not find an absolute hierarchy for one particular varna. But what is the hierarchy that you find in Dharma Sutra? You find hierarchy of conduct. The Brahmins, they were given respect. They were given respect for knowledge and conduct. In fact, there's another vector which comes into play here. This whole system is very complicated and complex. It is not very simple. Irrespective of the varna of an individual, the age of an individual had to be respected. This is there in Dharma Shastra. And most Indians, they know this subconsciously or unconsciously. They respect the age of an individual. So, this very linear straight-jacketed understanding of hierarchy created on our social, did not exist in ancient India till a very long period. I think a lot of time. I will just this is with regards to Varna and Gita. There are many individuals today floating around, and I will name them, particularly the Brahmins of South India, who have a very interesting take on this Chatur Varenyam verse that you find in the Bhagavad Gita. Sri Krishna says, Chatur Varenyam Maya Shrishtam Guna Karma Vibhavasya. Right? What these people are doing, and this is quite extensive, and that is the reason I'm telling you, or rather, let me put it this way, I'm addressing this issue. A lot of people have this understanding that when karma is being spoken about in this verse, prarabdha karma or karma phala is being spoken about. This is not true. When Sri Krishna mentions karma, he is basically talking about vocation. And when he talks about vocation, he basically does the same thing, which we mentioned at the beginning of this talk. He establishes the equation of guna equaling swabhav, equaling swadharma, equaling varna, equaling karma. The inner principle, the inner psycho-spiritual principle of this verse becomes extremely important. So when you are told that karma means karmaphala, these people are erroneously quoting the Gita. In fact, they should not quote the Gita. They should quote the Dharma Sutra or the Dharma Shastra tradition. Because in the Dharma Shastra tradition, it is clearly mentioned that the family into which you will be born will basically be dependent on your karma, your karmaphala. So if Dharma Sutra is used to give this kind of an explanation, it can be understood. But when it comes to Gita, this is a wrong interpretation. This is a wrong interpretation, and what happens is that the understanding that you find in the Smriti tradition gets transposed on the Shruti tradition. And from the Hindu perspective, it is very important that we understand the Shrutis properly. The Dharma Shastras can be junked. They are not supposed to be eternal. They were dependent on time, place, and the individual who created it. But what you find in the Shruti are basically eternal principles. And understanding this eternal principle is extremely important. Because if you understand this, then it will be important for you to understand your swabhava. And then, despite different kind of opposition that you will find, you will pick up a vocation which will be in tune with your predominant guna. And Sri Aurobindo says that when you engage in something like this, you begin to give force to the other gunas also. Let's say, for instance, you have the predominance of sattva in you, and you take up the vocation of seeking knowledge. As you are seeking knowledge, over a period of time, you will find that your Kshatriya tendencies, your Vaishya tendencies, your Shudra tendencies, they are also gaining more traction and power. You will start becoming a more integral person. And through this process, you will come to a point where you will be able to transcend your gunas. And that is why in Bhagavatam, there's a particular verse which states that if an individual from any varna, if he or she has performed his or her grihastha duties properly, then he or she will stand an equal chance of gaining moksha in comparison to any other individual from any other varna. So it is not, please listen to this, it is not that a Brahmin had a more chance of gaining moksha than a Shudra. This is completely untrue. And that is why when you look at the litany of sages in India, you find sages coming from all varnas. And it is extremely erroneous to call the sages Brahmins. A Brahmin is an individual who's guided by Sattva Guna. A yogi or a sage is an individual who has gone beyond the gunas, has become Trigunatita. It's a very important distinction. Even the learned, of the people make this error in making this distinction. There is a fundamental difference between a yogi and a Brahmin. These two categories should never be conflated. And anyone who is conflating these two categories does not really understand the foundations of the Varna, does not understand the nuts and bolts on which the system was pegged, does not understand the foundations, of the system, does not understand the metaphysics of the system. So, and this is particularly important for younger people who are engaged in this exercise of seeking vocation for themselves, that it is important that you figure out what your predominant guna is. If you want to join hotel management, don't let anyone tell you that you need to become a scholar. If you want to become a scholar, then do everything to become a scholar. If you want to become a politician, do everything to become a politician. It is only we who create this gradation. There is nothing wrong in individuals taking any vocation as long as the vocation is in tune with the inner constitution of that individual. With this, you will not only bring forth your other tendencies, you will also be able to eventually transcend the gunas and basically become yogis in the future. So with this, I will basically end. This is a long topic, and I hope, and I really hope that in the future, collectively, we are able the system this transition.
Thank you.
From the times when it was established to the times we find ourselves in currently. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you for this erudite lecture. And actually, it was like I'm having a conversation with my past. Although it was a one-week lecture, but I was literally going back and I was having a conversation with my past. And so we are running out of time. So I think I'll introduce Manan to take this forward. Manan is a computer engineer from Delhi School of Engineering and then did his MBA in finance from IIM Lucknow. He is currently on a sabbatical and trying to seek something, some depth of philosophy, life, and everything about it. So Manan, why don't you take the conversation forward?
Thank you, Adarsh. Thank you also to the organizers for this wonderful opportunity. It's a topic which is very close to my heart. And I think Kundan did a very elaborate job at setting the ball rolling. And I hope that the second half of the program, we'll be able to further build upon it and also add some new dimensions. What I'll do is I'll quickly share my own thoughts very briefly, given that we have a lack of time. And then I'll introduce Ashish and Nilesh. They can probably speak for 15-20 minutes, and then hopefully we can have a nice Q&A with the participants. And it is a topic which needs to be contemplated upon and tackled over and over again. So, some of it Kundan already covered, but what I really wanted to bring out is that the system is actually based on a very sound logic. And, it was not merely to keep the society functional. It was much more than that. It was not about just keeping it politically going or economically sustainable. It had a very well thought out, nuanced idea about spiritual evolution and growth in the collective, also very intrinsically, embedded. But unfortunately, that got lost over the last many centuries, and there's been a lot of distortion. And am I audible all right? Can someone just show a thumbs up? Okay. Yeah. It got so badly distorted over the last many centuries, and there've been systematic assaults on our psyche. And especially what bothers me a lot to observe all around is that even in India, we are very timid about wearing our Hindu identity on our sleeve, and we don't have a sense of collective pride. And also in the education, the mainstream education is not talking about our scriptures. It's not talking about the psycho-spiritual depth in our, in the Gita, like Kundan mentioned, also some of the Upanishads he touched upon, and he talked about Rita, Dharma, and the alignment in a state of flow, the Tao, Swabhava, Swadharma. There's so much. Now, the thing is that, this system was meant to be such that the society kind of operates both individually and collectively in a very harmonious manner and leads to some sense of a conscious evolution, which is also is very fascinating in Sri Aurobindo's thought. And, like Kundan mentioned, there was an intuitive understanding of a lot of things, and it was embedded in the psyche. My own grandmother, who was illiterate, was so wise, and probably the wisest person that I have encountered in my life yet. And so I really do resonate with a lot of things that Kundan said. And I think the distortions around this being largely heredity and also the sense of hierarchy, which I think was very fascinating, what you touched about the four, attributes and how the order was also very different. That was very fascinating, Kundan. I think that's very important, and thank you for that. I believe that in our education system, there's a urgent need to introduce a lot of these things. And I think Rashtam and Sampada in particular have been doing a great job at that. And with that, I'll kind of stop here and introduce Adarsh and Nilesh, and request them to share their thoughts for 15-20 minutes. And then hopefully we'll have around 20 odd minutes for a nice Q&A, where Kundan can also obviously jump back in, because there are some questions for him also on the chat screen. So let me introduce Nilesh first. I'm reading this out. Nilesh Marek is an experimenter, questioner, student and explorer of the human potential space, where behavior, systems, culture, and consciousness affect personal growth and creative novelty. He has 3 decades of experience in blue chip corporations like Coates Viola, Anderson Consulting, and Infosys, as well as some startups. These assignments covered a wide array of consumer and industrial products, management consulting, and IT in various countries and cultures. Over the last decade, he has been engaged in multi and transdisciplinary research and study across philosophy, social sciences, psychology, complexity, and spirituality, with a total immersion in integral yoga for the last few years. He has a BTech from IIT Bombay and an MBA from IIM Bangalore. Welcome, Nilesh. And Ashish Dhar is a Kashmiri Pandit, a refugee in his own country. He is a mechanical engineer and currently an entrepreneur. Mr. Dhar is the co-founder of Pragyata and Upward Foundation and the director of operations of the Indic Collective Trust. He is a practicing Hindu who is deeply interested in exploring the unfathomable depths of Indic knowledge. He is dedicated to bringing awareness about civilizational issues. Welcome to Ashish as well. If it's okay, Ashish, probably you could go first.
Yeah, sure. Thank you,
Thank
Madam. Thank you, Sampadananji, for inviting me. So, thank you, Rashtraam School, and thank you, Sampadananji, for having me on this panel. And thank you for having this discussion in the first place, because it's extremely important. Kundanji set the tone for the conversation going forward, and it was a very interesting session so far. And I hope that, you know, some of the things that I say, I wasn't expecting to be speaking for 15-20 minutes. I thought it was a panel discussion. So my words may not be as structured as expected, but yeah, I'll try and do justice to the time that is given to me. My own interest in caste was quite random. I haven't, you know, I started taking interest in it about 5 or 6 years ago, when when the JNU agitation began, and when they started doing the Tukde Tukde, Bharat Tere Tukde Honge, all those things. When that got started, that really interested me in what's really going on, and the noise about burning of Manusmriti and stuff like that. However, my interest in Sri Aurobindo's writing goes back several decades now, and what I found interesting is that, you know, when I was invited to this panel, the first question that struck me was, how do you actually make sense of what Sri Aurobindo has said about caste and what his views on caste really were? And unfortunately, I don't really have an answer, because in my reading of Sri Aurobindo's works, I found very little to do with caste, very little mention of it. There are some conversations here and there with disciples, perhaps a paragraph or two out of his very long, you know, and copious work that we have available in the current times, thanks to the work done by many scholars and devotees. And so, to really get a sense of his understanding of caste, honestly, I found the material insufficient. But whatever I could, you know, salvage from it, so that seemed to give you a very, you know, sort of balanced perspective, as you would expect from Sri Aurobindo. And I'll just, you know, read out one of the things that he has written. And I quote, he says, "This was what we meant when we said that caste was a socialistic institution. For Hindu civilization, being spiritual, based its institutions on spiritual and moral foundations and subordinated the material elements and material considerations." Now, this part is very important, where he says, "Caste, therefore, was not only an institution which ought to be immune from the second-hand denunciations so long in fashion, but a supreme necessity without which Hindu civilization could not have developed its distinctive character or worked out its unique mission." So here's a, you know, fairly straightforward endorsement, you could say, of the institution as such. But again, as I said, he's not written much. In other places, he has referred to, and he's talked about the spirit of caste arrogance and exclusiveness that crept into the system, and that eventually led to the downfall of the Hindu civilization and its subjugation. I am not entirely sure if the institution itself can be singled out as the reason for the subjugation of Hindus for several centuries. Perhaps there may be some merit in that argument. Perhaps caste and its unique evolution or let's say degradation, perhaps that contributed to us getting conquered 8 or 9 centuries back. But whether it is the single factor or the single most important factor, I have no data to really make that judgment, and I really don't know if anyone as yet has come to that conclusive judgment. Now, as far as caste is concerned, and there is a very very ignorant sort of attempts in the Western academia, as Kundanji said, of equating the entire Hindu religion with a very with just one of its aspects, which is the Varna Vyavastha. And there are some scholars, some Western scholars, who've gone to the extent of saying that if you remove caste, there is nothing left of the Hindu religion. Notwithstanding the complete, for the lack of a better word, I mean, it's a preposterous idea, really, to say such a thing, to make such a claim. But what it does point to is the, if I may use the word, integral nature of Hindu civilization, where you cannot really break it down into parts, because there is a very, very close, very, very solid, strong mesh of institutions and ideas that hold it together. And of course, caste is one of those. So if you really take out caste and look at it in isolation, it may look grotesque or it may look evil. And then you may also go on to make the claim that there is nothing other than caste. That is only because you haven't really understood it from a holistic perspective. You don't really understand the society as an integral whole, and how each part informs the other and how each part supports the other. So that's really the trouble of the modern Western worldview. And if I may say so, even Newtonian physics does make that error in a given context, right? So that dualism and that separation of mind and matter, sacred and profane, similarly, social and religious, secularism, self-dividing society into secular sphere and the religious sphere, all that is not really part of Hindu society, right? So therefore, the confusion that caste is equal to religion, caste is equal to Hindu religion, and that if you remove caste, there is nothing else. In fact, it is the opposite, that if you remove anything else also, then there is nothing. If you remove sampradayas from the Hindu religion, then perhaps there is nothing else remaining. If you remove temples from Hindu religion, then perhaps there is nothing else remaining. Right? If you remove ecology from Hindu religion, there is nothing else remaining, because the structure collapses. And that goes true for caste as well. So having said that, I'll just focus on caste a little bit, and I'll try to share my perspective, because I've been reading and researching about it for the last 5-6 years, and I've co-authored several articles on this as well, and created much controversy. So caste has 3 elements, right? Spiritual, economic, and social. And the social aspect is really reflected in the widespread or the tendency to marry within your caste, which Sri Aurobindo has also pointed out that is perhaps the last remaining citadel of caste, where if you, it's not enough. He says at one place, I read somewhere, that in order to, remove caste from Indian society, it is not enough to interdine, intermix and all that. The key is to intermarry. And that has been the long-standing feature of caste, which is endogamy. And that reflects in the social sphere. The economic sphere is, of course, the trade secrets and the guilds, and why there is a tendency in the first place of marrying within your caste. And the economic reason for that is, of course, to preserve trade secrets, pass on knowledge, and not lose the competitive advantage in the market. And the third is the spiritual aspect, which is say that, like, for example, there are several temples in India where only particular jatis are supposed to be archakas, whether they are Brahmin or non-Brahmin, that's not the point. But there are several temples where you cannot really just, conduct an exam and ask someone to become the priest. That is a very Christian, very pastor making a pastor sort of approach to Hinduism, which does not work. So there is a lineage that you go through, and that lineage is connected to the deity, and the deity has himself or herself appointed that kula to serve him or her. So that's the spiritual aspect of caste as well. Now, the thing about the difficulty in understanding caste is essentially the difficulty in understanding where we are today as a society, and understanding the effects of the colonial era, the colonial rule on our society today, whether it is the outward manifestations in the form of let's say railways and transport and all the material progress that has happened in the last 200 years, or whether it is in terms of how we think and the mindset that we have developed today, what you would call the modern mindset. And therefore, in other words, it is the difficulty in coming to terms with modernity itself. Because if you understand modernity, then you understand what pre-modern life, or you can imagine what pre-modern life would have been like, and why an institution like caste, or let's say the Varna Jati system, was inevitable, not just necessary. So some of the things that I'll just make some random points, and probably there's not much time to get into the depth of the subject, but I'll try and cover as much as I can, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer. So when I say that there is the issue of understanding modernity, I think the primary implication of that is that we must first understand, before making allegations about accessibility to education for the whole society, and whether it was a Brahminical system designed to keep privilege restricted to a certain caste or class and to keep others in an exploited state, I think we'll first have to introspect and understand what education really is. Is education really what we go through today by means of schooling and becoming, eventually joining a factory or a corporation and working as an employee somewhere, or is education something much wider, something much deeper, which really provides meaning to our lives? So that's a question that needs to be pondered on individually and in much depth before we arrive at such things. The point which I'm trying to make is that when they say that, yesterday when I posted a tweet saying that I'll be participating in a discussion, there was an earnest question on Twitter which said that, okay, Sri Aurobindo was not a Brahmin, and I belong, and the person who had tweeted, he had said that I belong to the same caste as Sri Aurobindo. And I'm wondering whether he had the adhikara in the traditional scheme of things to talk about these things, to hold forth on such subjects, given that he was not a Brahmin. So that's basic. That's the kind of misconceptions that are prevalent in society today. When we say what were the adhikaras of the Brahmins, or what were those things that were restricted to the Brahmins and others were not allowed, that was only as far as the rituals are concerned, right? The ritualistic elements of the Veda, and some of the recitations and stuff like that. But there was no bar on people exercising their mental faculties and and philosophizing, speculating. All that was, it's simply impossible for a society to function for thousands of years if there is such kind of tyranny happening. So there is no basis in that assertion that there was people were singled out and people were kept away from knowledge. If you look at the multiplicity of the texts itself, right? The Mahabharata itself starts with the proclamation that this is a text for Dvija, Shudra, and Stri, right? And both the Itihasas, the primary Itihasas, Ramayana and Mahabharata, they are performative texts for several centuries. In fact, for millennia, they have been passed on, and they've become the central texts, the backbone of the Indian civilization, because they've been performed, and they've, the performing artists have integrated that with their own art and gone about traveling the entire country and performing those texts. Ram Leela being an example that we can see even in these days. So to say that the Vedas were not meant for others and stuff like that is to betray a profound lack of understanding of how things functioned in the pre-modern era. Also, the issue of initiation, for example, when we talk about Janeu and why Shudras did not have Janeu, nobody really mentions, probably many don't even know, that Shudras had their own initiation rites. They had their own Pagadi Bandhna, they had their, even some communities had their own Janeu ceremonies. And there was no bar on such things because they went through a totally different kind of education. And this education, which is why I started my making this point with the plea that we need to first understand what education really is, right? So if you are a Brahmin and you go through 14 years of Veda Adhyayan before you can actually become or be deemed to be an expert in certain subjects, parallelly, the Shudra, the artisan, is going through his own education, which lasts 10 to 14 years. And that is as rigorous as the education of the Brahmin or the education of the Kshatriya. And that the proof of that you will see in the architectural and artistic accomplishments of the Hindu civilization by way of by what the Shudras have done, right? So there is no question about their being educated, even having access to, not just access to, but in some cases having a complete command over Sanskrit. You have inscriptional evidence where the Shudras have themselves written about their the piece of art or piece of a sculpture or the temple that they've made, and they've given credit to themselves or the chief architect in Sanskrit itself. Also, the kind of technical expertise required to build and to create such forms of art and architecture would not have been possible without advanced knowledge of material sciences, mathematics. So these are just logical deductions you got to make, and there is enough scholarship which is already present. These are not original claims that I'm making. There is enough scholarship which is already present which talks about these things. So unfortunately, what has happened is that these forms, these scholars and these works of scholarship have been systematically kept away from public consciousness, because we know that the academia has a certain agenda of its own, especially in the West, as well as its subordinates in India. There's some, and given that sway of the academia, they don't find it convenient to promote such works and to talk about these things. They just stonewall such scholars and keep them away from public discourse and recognition. I think I've sort of almost reached my stipulated time, but I'll just make another speculative comment here, because this is something that I've sort of arrived at independently on my own. through various readings. And the speculative comment is about the Anuloma and Pratiloma marriages that Kundanji mentioned. And it is my understanding that the Varna system and the Jati arrangement in which society was organized, it was designed, as Sri Aurobindo has said, that it was designed to fulfill certain roles, you see, and to create a society of a certain kind. And that society, I'll just read out what Sri Aurobindo has said. The original purpose of the caste system has been lost. In ancient times, there was the distinction of caste with a clear purpose. It was sought to develop different types, and marriage within the same caste was intended to help this system. The Brahmins sought to develop certain intellectual powers to make their minds subtle for the consideration of higher things. The Kshatriyas sought to develop character, which was all important for the functions of that class. The Vaishyas also sought to develop a particular kind of intellectual powers, which could be of help to them in the matters of business. The fourfold distinction could not be adhered to when there occurred the mixture of races. So he's talking about endogamy here and the necessity of endogamy for achieving this kind of a mix in society. So if you look at, if you go through Manusmriti, for example, you will find that the text is really obsessed with the achara of none other than the Brahmins, right? It is only talking, not only, but predominantly it is concerned with how the Brahmins should conduct themselves. And in that way, Manusmriti is a very, very Brahman-oriented text, right? And if we try and make sense of what the Manusmriti asks of the Brahmins in terms of how to conduct themselves and how to organize themselves, what kind of lifestyle they should have, it is what you would call oppressive in the modern lingo. It is oppressive for Brahmins itself. To live like a Brahmin is to be in denial of all kinds of luxuries. It is to be an ascetic of the highest order. It is to, to live a frugal life and, not to accumulate and to just, basically be an exemplar for the rest of the society in terms of being an ideal sage. Not everyone, not every Brahmin would be able to achieve that, but that was the idea. And in order to achieve that, right, who in their right mind would really want to be a Brahmin unless forced to be, right? So now the statement that I'm trying to make here is that for the Brahmin caste to even exist and to be true to its vocation and its ideal, it would not be possible without some bit of coercion. And it is as true for the Brahmins as it is for the rest of the society. In fact, it is more applicable to the Brahmin than it is for the rest of the society, because as you go to the other castes, the amount of the demand from you as an individual is lesser and lesser in terms of what you have to, the kind of lifestyle that you have to live. So Pratiloma marriages would make sense in such a scenario, because otherwise, no female would really be willing to live a life of a Brahmin's wife, you see, because it is such a difficult life to live. And if you go through the classical texts, you see all kinds of evidence with respect to the point that I'm making, where the Rishika, or sometimes the wife of the sage who's not herself a Rishi also, she's not very, very happy with her the kind of life that she's living. Let's take Sudama's life for it. Sudama's wife, for example, the kind of things she says to Sudama are indicative of her, of her exasperation with the kind of poverty that she's going through, right? So that's a speculative thing that I just want to mention, because Anuloma and Pratiloma was mentioned. So that it was necessary in perhaps to maintain that kind of dharmic structure. And dharma is not necessarily what the spontaneous expression of society is, because as Sri Aurobindo talks about, there are several types of nature. There is the lower nature, there is the higher nature. And in order to align with the higher nature, you will have to sort of keep the lower nature in check, the vital impulses, so to speak, the mental distractions, right? All that. So there's much, like I said, there is, my talk may not be very structured, and I think I've already exceeded my time. So I'll stop here, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that people have on this. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashish. I think you added a couple of very interesting new points, and we'll build on this. But it's already 11:40. Let's have Nilesh go now. And Nilesh, if you could kind of wind up by, say, 12, we'll have a good 25-30 minutes of Q&A. After Nilesh, we'll jump straight to Q&A. So please do write your questions on the chat screen and try to keep them short and crisp. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you to Sampath and the Rashtraam team for this invitation. We have had a very comprehensive coverage of various points around this rather contentious subject. What I am thinking of doing is bring about a few points from Sri Aurobindo's. I'm not an expert in Varna and Jati per se, but a few points that come up from a philosophical perspective and related to what has already been mentioned here. I think it will add to the discussion. And now let me start off by one of the questions that came up, I saw in the chat, that how did this degeneration that Kundan mentioned, there has been a certain degeneration of an original deeper significance into something which is not so beneficial, something which is crude and in many ways undesirable. Now, question came up that how did this ossification happen? How did this degeneration happen? There is a kind of answer Sri Aurobindo himself provides, which I will try to propose as an explanation for why this has happened, why this degeneration happened. And this ties into the whole movement of nature in the evolution of mankind itself. Mankind began in the earlier days, in the days of the original spiritual heritage. The rishis actually operated from an intuitive level of consciousness. There's somebody asking a question, but I probably will take it at 12 o'clock since we'll have enough time after that. Now, what happened is that whilst a few rishis operated from an intuitive level of consciousness, the larger part of society kind of operated at an infra-rational level or at a sub-rational level, more instinctive level. So it was the intention of nature throughout the world and also in India to have a much wider proliferation of the intellectual mental development in humanity, in a larger section of humanity, to then go back to reclaiming the intuitive power. So this is the whole thing about the height as well as the widening in the process of natural evolution, so that there is a stronger and a more secure foundation as the evolution of consciousness happens through ascent and integration. So we are going back to the root of this whole issue as to why did this happen. And Varna Jati is just one exemplification of a much broader trend of the evolution of human consciousness itself. To make the mental, rational, the intellectual foundation strong, we have about 2 millennia of cultural development in which Europe and the Western world have actually taken more covert and wider leaps in terms of outer forms of human endeavor. And that is why we have a much more overt and well-known development of Western philosophical thought and even physical sciences in the West. And India, although having originated many of these in an earlier age, kind of went into covert mode, right? If we map this trajectory of consciousness to social development, we find an answer that Sri Aurobindo provides in his nomenclature of social development in the human cycle. So just to quickly capture, in the human cycle, he builds on Lamprecht's terminology to actually trace the cycle of social development in a collective sense, which maps the individual psychology, because ultimately the collective is the sum total of individuals. So Sri Aurobindo names 5, taking on from Lamprecht's terminology, 5 stages of social development. But unlike in the West, where it is defined usually through outer forms and means, Sri Aurobindo meant it from a psychological position. So he defines the symbolic, the typal, the conventional, the individual rational, and the subjective. And these have to be, because this is not physical material science, this is to be taken flexibly, that each of these are not watertight distinctions, but they all blend into each other. They blend into each other in every individual as well as in every society. But to the point that Kundan mentioned, there's a certain predominance, and that predominance at a particular time frame helps us characterize the social developmental stature with that particular term. So the symbolic is essentially the stage of social development where mankind discovers his relationship with nature, and the outer forms are not taken for their literal value, but the upper echelons of society who have developed the intuitive level of consciousness try to look for a meaning behind the symbol. So symbolic represents the quest for deeper, higher, and inner truths behind outer symbols. So if one were to think of the dispensation of spirit in the typological development of the individual and the corporate existence, one can map the 4 varnas to 4 parts of the divine body. If one were to symbolically anthropomorphize, to make an anthropomorphic representation, we have the mouth representing something, the Brahman, the arms representing the Kshatriyas, the thighs representing the Vaishyas, and the feet representing the Shudras. This is not a question of inferiority or superiority in the way it is being promulgated today, largely as a result of, or to a certain extent, the British, But this has to be seen as an overall constitution of the divine body that requires the fullness of expression of the intention of spirit in manifestation, right? So this symbolic understanding of the parts of the divine body, not in a literal sense, but representative of the intention of the spirit to embody these different faculties in the social fabric through individuals, was the symbolic stage. This is the origin of the Varna system. Now, if you take the next stage as typal basically means that every individual exercises a certain leaning, a certain preference based on inner nature, disposition, hidden competency, developmental imperative, all of these things, and therefore makes a choice of what he or she would like to do, how he or she would like to operate and contribute to the overall totality of social development. So there is a mapping of individual development to social development. So the typal indicates that every person makes a choice on he or she would like to do. And this has to be flexible, because this is not just a watertight one-time denomination of a role, but a part of a self-developmental progression of an individual. Every individual within a particular life may choose the path of knowledge, may choose the path of leadership, administration, and even war, may choose the path of interaction and relationship and mutuality and exchange, and may choose the path of unconditional service including the performance of menial tasks. And every individual has the freedom, or ought to have the freedom, to even choose the sequence or the parallelism of these choices. Some of these can be parallel, some of these can be in series. So from the symbolic, we move to the typal. From the typal, we move to the conventional, which is where humanity moved from an intuitive clearly to a mental mode of consciousness, or approached a mental mode of consciousness through the adherence to conventions. A conventional society is a society where the outer form or the function or the ritual or the mechanical act unfortunately ends up assuming a greater significance than the inner truth, of which the form is just a representation. So it is unfortunate, yet it was necessary in the progression of nature, as we discussed earlier, for there to be a conventional age. And I would say that more than the Western world, India or large parts of India are still stuck at the conventional level of mental development, where going to the temple and chanting something or giving an offering and then coming back and doing a corrupt act and almost trying to justify the fact that because I have done the chanting, this will be forgiven. That is what is called the conventional mode of thinking. In Western developmental psychology, this is called the mythic mode of operation. Now, needless to say, conventional had to make way for what is called the individual rational. This is the fourth stage in Lamprecht and Sri Aurobindo's elaboration. The individual rational is where all conventions are questioned. As you can see, this is absolutely necessary so that so that society does not get strangulated in the encrustation of conventionalism. There needs to be and has been the individual rational, where every individual questions every convention and demands answers from a place that has to satisfy his or her own mental questioning. And unless the answer is satisfactory, which he or she can derive from himself or from outside, he or she can choose to refuse the convention. And that is what has happened. If you look at medieval Europe, the whole Reformation movement was of iconoclastic rejection of the ecclesiastical imposition of the church. The whole reason Buddhism surfaced in India much earlier was because some of the ossification of the ritualism, the encrustation which happened from the deeper symbolic meaning of the Vedic philosophy, had to be dismantled through epistemological anarchism. Buddhism was nothing but a movement of epistemological anarchism. And of course, the other aspect of it was stepping away from the movements of nature. And then we have, so the larger point is that the individual rational has also happened in India a bit later, and there has been a strong gap in between, which is a very important civilizational feature that again maps back to the importance of the completion of the four varnas. So just to complete the earlier story, after the individual rational is the subjective age. This is the spiritual, this is the advent of the spiritual age, provided we have true subjectivism and not false subjectivism. Not ego-based introspection, but a universal opening and widening of the consciousness to the larger realms of spirit. And the subjective age is the age that we, or at least the leading age of today's consciousness, is. It is from the subjective age that we can actually move into a true spiritual age, and the true spiritualization of society can happen. In the subjective age, we go back on a broader frame of an intellectual development over 2 millennia. We go back and reclaim the intuitive power of human consciousness, but over a much stronger, wider, and a much more secure foundation. which is why this discussion today is extremely pertinent, because man has today reached the end or has hit the law of diminishing returns as far as the mental, individual, rational age of consciousness is concerned. He is going around in circles. So this is the time to reclaim the true subjectivism and to reclaim the hidden significance of the typological construction and stratification of society, symbolic of the divine dispensation for the individual and corporate existence of society in its totality. Now, what is the proof? One may ask, what is the proof that all four are required in a society? Well, what had happened, I would say, as he mentions in the Foundations of Indian Culture, that actually because of the nature of the inner journey that the Indian spirituality took through Buddhism, which rejected nature as a domain of suffering, and through the monistic Advaita philosophy, which rejected the operations of nature as some form of illusion, there was a renunciation of the vitality of life in some sense or form, and a renunciation of Shakti. And when you renounce Shakti, Shakti renounces you. So we find that one could say that the Kshatriya, the Kshatra Tej, and the Vaishya Tej took a kind of a backseat. And Indian society was only on two legs, of the Brahmin and the Shudra. And the hypothesis, this is the point that Ashish also made, there's a very strong hypothesis and a reason to suppose that a large part of the outer impoverishment of the Indian civilization and its susceptibility to attacks from outside was because of the erosion and desiccation of this vitality due to the withdrawal of Shakti. The totality of spirit, that was the vision of the Vedic symbolic, and then the intellectual philosophical Vedanta and the Upanishadic age, as if took a back seat, and Indian civilization went through what it had to go through. Be that as it may, our task is a full reclamation of the power of spirit, of the spiritual intention in its totality, and revitalize all four aspects of the divine dispensation, both within society and within every individual. I and you need to discover and hone the faculty of knowledge as much as the faculty of the fighting spirit, as much as the faculty of reciprocity and mutuality and exchange, as much as the humility of unconditional service. And this we need to do not only within this life, but across lives. So if we take the whole rebirth principle, society through its ossification and through its rigidification has no locus standi to determine what my swabhava is. Not just the swabhava in this life, which leads to my swadharma, but the progression, the evolutionary soul progression of my swabhava across lives. In a previous life, typologically, I may have been through a warrior experience. And therefore, to complement the totality of my own self-development, I may need to go through a knowledge cycle in this life or in the first part of this life. You see, who can determine this? Can society have any clue about this? Not only not society, even the individual does not have a clue about it unless he or she begins to live in the inner self and reclaim the connection with the psychic being. Only when the whole truth and the purpose of his existence becomes clear to him. So Varna is a symbolic representation of a certain mode or a certain mix of gunas, to the point that Kundan mentioned. And this mix of gunas is a trajectory that every individual has to take in relational harmony and equilibrium with the rest of society, with other individuals like him, so that there is a holistic, harmonious progression and a harmonious interchange between individual development and social development. This is a very complex matter. This has to be determined from the inner law of the spirit and not through any outer convention, because the outer convention by its very nature is ill-equipped to even deal with this, to even understand this, let alone deal with it. The last point I'll make just for one more minute, one has to look at the inner significance and the outer form. And if one looks at the, the distinction between the inner significance of the four varnas and the outer form, one automatically gets a sense of interoperability and fluidity, right? If you look at the Brahmin, the outer form is what? Religious, ministration, teaching, instruction. But what is the true inner significance? Ascesis, purity, practice of spiritual truth, right? Similarly, the Kshatriya, the outer form may be government, politics, leadership. What is the inner significance? The warrior spirit, protection, chivalry, courage, isn't it? The outer form of the Vaishya might be business or mercantilism or commerce. What is the inner significance? Relational exchange, harmony, unity through mutuality, indifference. So there's a very deep spiritual truth behind this. Shudra may be a servant or a menial worker or a laborer. But as we said, the inner significance is self-offering. Now, it can become clear that even while being in a so-called outer form of a Kshatriya, I might be a business leader or a king or a political leader, but nothing prevents me from having and invoking the all four inner significances in that role. Whilst being a leader or a manager, I need to have ascesis. I need to have ascesis in terms of the dominion of soul over nature. Of course, I need to have the warrior spirit. I also need to have relational exchange and mutuality. It is not that I have to be a businessman to invoke the inner spirit of mutuality. I can do it being a Brahmin in the outer form, or a Kshatriya in the outer form, even a Shudra in the outer form. So, when one tries to map the inner with the outer, one sees the complete ludicrousness of the rigidification, which happens when the mental level of consciousness operates where it deals only with representations rather than the inner truth of things. And that understanding is required for us to be able to invoke these principles within ourselves so that we can achieve the yogic station of the Trigunatīta. And I think with that, I will hand over to Manan and invite any questions if there are.
Thank you, Nilesh. Thanks for the very important enumeration of the cycles of human society, which is also very fascinating and does make a lot of sense. Thanks for that. And sorry to Ashish and Nilesh. I think you probably could have shared much more. I think what Nilesh mentioned about invoking all the four attributes intuitively also makes a lot of sense. And the only thing that I would probably like to mention at this point is that, even in the Western world, there is so much academia, there's so much fascination with archetypes and specialization and things like that, while we have it all in our scriptures and it's been practiced seamlessly over so many millennia. So why not incorporate it wholeheartedly, embrace it wholeheartedly, not just in education, but also in society, and have conversations around it, right? My background of having worked internationally and in India, I see that this wisdom is so applicable to, say, business strategy, right? To working in the collective, to developing people, to developing resources, to public policy, to consulting, and so on and so forth. So first of all, I think I really want to extend congratulations to Rashram School for this very, very pertinent discussion. And I'm sure that all of us are looking forward to many more of these. In terms of question, first of all, I think probably it makes sense to go back to Kundan, because there were some questions which were posed specifically to him. Maybe if he has gathered his thoughts, if he would like to also build upon what Nilesh and Ashish said, because there were some new points. Maybe Kundan can take 3-4 minutes, and then Ashish and Nilesh, if you really have something else to contribute, another 2 minutes maybe. And meanwhile, if people can chat, put the questions in the chat, and if Abhishek can help me organize some of these questions, then that would be great. So over to you, Kundan. And what we'll do at the end is Abhishek will extend a vote of thanks, but we do have 20 minutes. So without wasting more time, over to you, Kundan. Thank you.
I'm actually looking forward to receiving questions.
There was a question which was posted around the gunas being passed on through genes. If you could talk about that briefly, and also ossification, but I think Nilesh touched upon it beautifully, and so did Ashish. So maybe we could skip that one. But if you could talk about the gunas being transferred through genes, that would be nice. What's the heredity component of gunas?
Yeah, I have actually been thinking about it. I haven't found any answer yet. I'm exploring. So the hypothesis that I have for me is, why did they allow anulom marriages, intervarna anulom marriages, and why did they disallow, pratilom marriages? Did they think? I mean, if the gene question will become important, then did they think that that the guna was being transmitted only by male, or what was going on? I have not been able to find any answer yet, but my see, the thing is that I need to first understand before we figure out the truth value of the action. I have not been able to do that, but I'm pretty much sure that there was a rationale. And if I keep looking, at some point in time, I will discover it. So I'm in the phase of finding it out, Right. With regards to these things, the way I take, I bring the orientation of a researcher. So I need to find evidence in order to kind of make my points. And I have not found any points as yet.
Sure, Kundan, no problem. I think it's a tricky one anyhow, so we can let it pass.
No, we have to figure it out. Instead of saying
no, as in for now,
that these people were complete idiots and they did not know what they were doing. What was the reason? I have certain speculations, but they may be politically incorrect. So I'm actually not going there.
We'll stick to
I have to figure
agenda.
I have to figure it out.
Yes, we'll get
See,
back
with
to
regards to one point, with regards to the decline. See, the point that I made was internal decline and external aggression. So I was not saying that that the external aggression did not happen. The complete sentence was internal decline and external aggression. And the way I see it is that if an individual is not guna-based Kshatriya, and if you send that individual to fight wars, right? I don't think you're going to win wars. And similarly, if an individual is not inclined, scholastically, then the person is not going to make a good Brahmin. So I personally think that, I don't dispute that Buddhism did not contribute to the decline, or that Shakti receded from India. I totally do not dispute any of those. But I'm also of this view that the hereditary principle of the Varna system, could have exposed us to lose certain wars, which proved instrumental. But that will be taking a very lopsided perspective. The fact also is that we were able to survive as a civilization is also because of the Varna Jati system. The Christians were not able to convert because in order to convert us, they had to convert a community. They had to convert a whole jati, right? So jati basically was one of the prominent reasons why the conversion did not happen. And I'm pretty much sure that jati must have played an integral role during the Muslim invasions also. Here is something very interesting which Sri Aurobindo has written, and I think I would want to read that, because that passage actually gives a very comprehensive view of how Sri Aurobindo looks at the situation. Just give me 1 second, I will be able to find it out. Or in the meantime, you can go to a different question and I will figure out that passage.
Okay, I'm tempted to go to Ashish and ask him if he wants to build something on what Nilesh shared about the 5 stages and also about invoking the 4 qualities. I think Ashish has also talked about it in some other places. So, Ashish.
Well, before that, I would just want to weigh in on the question that was just getting discussed about the decline and the contribution of the Jati Varna system. And I think that the decline is such a complex subject that again, to single out one aspect of society as which is perhaps the essential aspect of society, to make it responsible for what happened, for the bad things that happened, while at the same time acknowledging that it was also responsible for the flourishing of arts and architecture, for the surplus being generated in manufacturing, for the towering intellectual achievements of the Hindu civilization. I think there is a contradiction right there. And the fact of the matter is that there is no way in which we can actually come to a conclusive understanding of why there was a decline. Yes, different things contributed. And I am inclined to believe that singling out caste is certainly not the right approach. About the 4 stages of humanity and the model that Sri Aurobindo has given, that is one part of Sri Aurobindo's writing that, to be very honest, has not appealed to me. I look at Sri Aurobindo from a very individualistic standpoint in terms of my own practice as a Hindu, in terms of understanding my own sadhana or puja, whatever. But the model that he has for humanity, I have had a look at it, but it hasn't appealed to me. So I wouldn't be in a position to really comment on that.
So I've been able to find that passage.
Yeah, Kundan, please. Yeah.
So he writes, it becomes a soulless form and prolongs itself in a state of corruption, degeneracy, and oppressive formalism. When the users that justified are no longer in existence. Even when its ways can no longer be made consistent with the developing needs of the growth of humanity, the formal system persists and corrupts the truth of life and blocks progress. Indian society did not escape this general law. It was overtaken by these deficiencies, lost the true sense of the thing which it set out to embody, and degenerate into a chaos of caste, developing evils which we are now much embarrassed to eliminate. But it was a well-devised and necessary scheme in time. It gave the community the firm and nobly built stability it needed for the security of its cultural development. A stability hardly paralleled in any other culture. And as interpreted by the Indian genius, it became a greater thing than mere or outward economic, political, and social mechanism intended to serve the needs and convenience of the collective life. So, we can, from a logical standpoint, we can engage in either or argument about it, but we can have a perspective which is both and. So it is highly possible that, that it was the same system which led to our decline, which also eliminated our complete elimination, as has happened in many different societies, worldwide. I mean, I'm sitting, on a continent where native peoples hardly exist. Latin America is completely converted. There's hardly anything of African culture left in Africa. So it could be both. And I think, at least from the Sri Aurobindo standpoint, they can be incorporated. We don't need to take an either or position on this. In fact, transcendence of the binary is an integral component of the system of yoga. So this is how I see it. And at the same time,
Absolutely. Thank you.
As I said, that this is about speculation. We just don't know at this point in time. Maybe in the future,
Right.
something will emerge. We'll be able to figure it out.
Yeah. Thanks, Kundan. Because of lack of time, I'll probably have to cut you short now. But yeah, makes complete sense. And also what Ashish said, this is, I wanted to make two brief points here. One is around what Kundan just read out, Sri Aurobindo very explicitly says that evolution happens spirally. So we go up, we come down. We have the sense that, okay, we have fallen back in, but the lows are higher and so are the highs. So it's like moving on from one peak to a higher peak. And that's like a journey, right? And so what Nilesh said about the 2 millennia, at least resonates very deeply with me, because in some ways, now that we have exhausted to some extent, our material cravings and we've seen what's happening in the world and the crisis that we are grappling with, come what may, every which way. There is indeed a awakening which is happening, especially in the younger generation, and it is happening across the world. So there is some positive also in all of it. The other thing, and this is around not necessarily being either or, but more of an inclusive, reciprocal and approach. Sri Aurobindo also talks about the higher planes of consciousness when it comes to the mind, right? And he says that already at the level of the higher mind, the contradictions kind of start to come together in harmony. And then there is the illumined mind, the intuitive mind. And clearly in the symbolic age, the rishis, the yogis, and even the general society was pretty much very intuitively, consciously connected to those planes. And the aspiration should really be to bring that kind of an element also in our teaching, in our education, in our society, in our conversations. What, if I may say so, this is not a question which has been posed, but could we talk about platforms like this and also say social media and also media in general, and what could be the role of, of some kind of a consolidation of Sanatan Dharma all over the world? And do you think that's something you would want to talk about? But if you could restrict your views only to 30 seconds, that would be great. Because I really do think that, maybe if Sampath Da could kind of also share his views for 2-3 minutes, I would want to invite him as well. But would you want to share about the role of social media, this hyper globalization? And clearly battle lines are drawn on multiple sides without elaborating on it. I think we all know what we're talking about. So Nilesh, could I pass it on to you first?
Yeah, actually, before that question, there is an important thing that he has written in the Foundations of Indian Culture. As those of us who have read that book, we know that the last section of that book, he talks about the polity, right? I mean, after covering sculpture, architecture, he talks about polity. And there is a clear indication in his writing of the role of the Jati Dharma or the Jati Sangha in the governance of society. So it is clearly there, it has played a role in the whole movements of nature. And I quote, as with the Kula, I mean, before this, he gives different reasons of why the Jatis emerged as subdivisions of each of the Varnas, right? And there were different reasons for each of the 4 Varnas. But he eventually says, as with the Kula, each caste has its own caste law and the rule of living and conduct called Jati Dharma, and its caste communal assembly called Jati Sangha. As the Indian polity in all its institutions was founded on a communal and not on an individualistic basis, the caste also counted in the political and administrative functioning of the kingdom. So there is a clear role. I mean, nature does not do anything which is completely pointless or useless. And I think Ashish mentioned the guild system, the whole guild framework of an association of merchants and traders to protect their own interests. These sorts of formations emerged from some kind of stratification. So it is not without any utility that a large part of the social and administrative resilience at the grassroots level of the Indian civilization was possible through this structure. To your question, Manan, yes, it is $1 million question and it has to be done. And because the age of the internet brings about a level of connectivity which supersedes and kind of transcends the limitation of physical proximity and distance. The very fact that we are having this conversation now and are able to do so with this level of functionality indicates that there's a role of internet to be played, not just in nature in the way it is being used today, but at a deeper level of connectivity. And and Sampath and I have shared some and discussed something, and maybe that there is a forum in which we can discuss it. The answer is a big resounding yes. It can be done and it will be done.
Yeah, I'll just quickly share my thoughts about this. I think, yes, of course, it is important. It is perhaps necessary for Sanatan Dharma to, to be spread all over the world. And in his Uttarpara speech, Sri Aurobindo made that absolutely clear that what is known as nationalism is Sanatan Dharma and Sanatan Dharma is nationalism. So his endorsement and his belief in Hindu nationalism was essentially the spread of Sanatan Dharma outside India. However, the problem that we are facing 100 years or more after the Uttarpara speech is that Sanatan Dharma is on shaky foundation within India itself. And unless that is fixed, the ambition of it going outside and healing the rest of the world is slightly out of place, in my opinion.
Right. Short on time. There are some questions. Apologies. Probably we can answer them later. Maybe Abhishek can help out. Can I request Sampadda to share his views, please?
Also, thank you, Kundan, Ashish, and Nilesh for elaborating on certain aspects. And one thing which I wanted to mention here, and as a response to what Ashish said, that there are not much material with regard to this in Sri Aurobindo. So Sri Aurobindo speaks of the spiritualized society, and he talks in terms of the inner significance of these four powers, what Nilesh mentioned. And there's a specific writing by Sri Aurobindo called Sapta Chatushtaya. So in that, he speaks of the inner significances of these four Shaktis, four Tejas, Brahma Tejas, Kshatra Tejas, Vaishya Shakti, and Shudra Shakti. And his book, The Mother, like in the beginning, what I mentioned, the Maheshwari, Mahakali, Mahalakshmi, Mahasaraswati. And all these will be applicable when we contemplate more on the vision of Sri Aurobindo, vision of that spiritualized society, the formation of the spiritualized society. And much of the issues connected with the present caste system and then linking it with the original idea of Varna and Jati will have a greater solution when we contemplate on these inner significances. So, and in synthesis of yoga also, and under Chaturvarnya, in the essays on the Gita, there is much insight that he has brought to this whole idea of Varna and Jati. So maybe in some later session, we can have elaborate discussion on these inner significances and then how to map it to the present issues connected with Varna and Jati. So that's what I wanted to mention. And then thank you all again. And then Manan, you can take it forward. What next?
Right. So 5 minutes to go. Immense gratitude to all the participants, and please do subscribe and continue to join us in such discussions, and also participate actively. Thanks to Kundan for joining us from the US, and also to Nilesh and Ashish, and to Rashtram. And I think I should hand it over to Abhishek now to extend a word of thanks and wind up for the day. And also, if you have any announcements to make about the YouTube channel or the website or something, please do that now. Thanks, Abhishek. Thanks, everyone.
Namaste. Namaste. Bye-bye.
Just a second, sir, if you would stay.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'll just extend.
Sorry, Abhishek. Sorry about that.
So thank you, Manan, for this wonderful moderation, and thank you, Ashish sir. I think we have connected virtually, but this is our social media, but this is the first time we are meeting face to face over webinar. And thank you for so wonderfully putting the social, economical, and spiritual aspects of the Jati. And thank you, Nilesh ji, for so subtly putting the different stages of psychological development that Sri Aurobindo has elaborated so nicely. Thank you, Dr. Kundan Singh ji, for touching upon many parts of Varna, Jati, and how the Western academia and the modernity is attacking us since few centuries. The purpose of this webinar has been the defense of Indian culture, and we at Rastram are running a 1-year course on Sri Aurobindo coinciding with the 150th birth anniversary, and currently the module that is running and only one lecture has been completed is the foundations of Indian culture. I would request all the members who are in the webinar to please go to rastram.org and check out the course and do subscribe if you like for the fourth module, the foundations of Indian culture. Thank you again, Mananji, for taking out your time, and thanks others for so wonderfully moderating the first session. And at last, I thank Sampath sir for this wonderful idea and for this wonderful and bringing so many erudite scholars in one platform. We'll meet again in Bechariki 2 with a new topic, contextualizing Sri Aurobindo in a new topic. Namaste to everyone.
Probably we can have a minute of silence and then wind up.
Yeah. We will have a minute of silence and then we can move on.